December 1, 1941. A baffling order zoomed across the wires in Manila, direct from President Franklin D. Roosevelt to Admiral Thomas Hart. The directive defied logic. Send 3 small, lightly armed vessels, no destroyers, no submarines, into the waters off Indochina, where the Japanese fleet was amassing in force. One schooner was to patrol near Cam Ranh Bay, another off Cape St. and a third near the southern tip of Vietnam. Each would fly the American flag. Each was to observe, report, and hold its ground. Hart was stunned. The vessels were too slow to run, too fragile to fight, and too few to matter tactically. They would be sitting ducks in hostile waters. Unless that was the point. In the last days of November 1941, the possibility of war in the Pacific was growing by the hour. US intelligence spotted Japanese forces amassing off Indochina's coast. War seemed inevitable. But where it would start was anyone's guess. The Philippines, Malaya, and maybe even Singapore were all possibilities. Amid this uncertainty, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a secret and rather odd directive. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, relayed the order to Admiral Thomas Hart, commander of the Asiatic Fleet in Manila. Hart was instantly startled by the order, not just what it said, but the strange wording it used. President directs that the following be done as soon as possible. Charter 3 small vessels to form a, quote, defensive information patrol, unquote. Minimum requirements to establish identity as United States men of war are commanded by a naval officer, and to mount a small gun and 1 machine gun would suffice. Filipino crews may be employed with minimum naval ratings to accomplish purpose, which is to observe and report by radio Japanese movements, top secret. That a seemingly innocuous mission came directly from the president was unusual enough, but the last line made Hart look twice. Top secret. He also wondered how these mostly Filipino-manned ships were going to provide reliable intelligence. Multiple sources already provided constant intelligence indicating that a Japanese invasion force was assembling on Hainan Island and in Vichy-controlled French Indochina. There would be no standard Navy ships. Only the aging USS Isabel, a converted yacht, would come from Navy stock. The other 2 would be chartered civilian schooners, hastily militarized. The Asiatic Fleet, largely a symbolic force composed of 3 cruisers, 13 aging World War I-era 4-stack destroyers, and no fighter planes, did possess a significant asset: 27 submarines. These subs were not only capable of performing reconnaissance missions from the surface, but they could do so covertly. In his November 25th report, Admiral Hart sternly requested additional aerial reconnaissance, given that elevated terrain made ship-based observation both cumbersome and inefficient. He also warned that picket ships would face greater danger than aircraft. These 3 small vessels would not bring any additional information about Japan's naval movements. To Hart, the order was bordering on the absurd. The only logical reason was that the president intended these ships to be attacked. A patrol plane, downed in hostile waters, might vanish, but a US-flagged schooner sunk by Japanese torpedoes would make headlines. The news would surely reach the masses back home. The White House never used the word, but Hart saw it for what it might be: a tripwire operation. President Roosevelt believed the US needed to join the global fight against fascism But the American public, burned out by World War I, wanted peace. So clear was his conviction that during the Argentia Conference off the coast of Newfoundland in early August 1941, President Roosevelt gave Prime Minister Winston Churchill a firm assurance. If Japan launched an attack on British or Dutch colonies in the Far East, Britain could rely on military support from the United States. But Roosevelt couldn't commit US forces to aid the British without a congressional declaration of war, and Congress was bound to a public still staunchly isolationist. Barely 20% supported entering the fight. At the War Council on November 25th, the same day the Thanksgiving war warning went out, Secretary of War Henry Stimson posed the real question of how to get Japan to fire the first shot. No one had an answer. But at the next meeting on November 28th, as Roosevelt prepared a personal message to Emperor Hirohito, someone brought up the Panay incident, the accidental sinking of a US gunboat by Japan in 1937, an event that had nearly drawn the US into war. There's no surviving record of what was said at the December 1st meeting, the one that produced the 3 small vessels directive. But historians believe its focus was clear. What happens if Japan attacks only British or Dutch colonies, Singapore, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, but avoids American soil? How do we respond if the Philippines remain untouched? The likely answer was to find a way to force Japan's hand, create a situation where they strike first, where they sink an American ship. Starting the war on America's terms instead of Japan's was invaluable. Losing 3 decoy ships to avoid a possible massive Japanese surprise attack was worth the questionable ethics of the operation. While suspecting but not knowing the possible true motivations of the mission, Hart continued to make the preparations. The schooner Lanikai was commandeered in Manila, crewed by Americans and Filipinos, and placed under the command of a young lieutenant, Kemp Tolley. Isabel was readied as well. A 3rd schooner, the Molly Moore, was also selected. The men were briefed. Their task was to carefully shadow the Japanese Navy, blend into the waters off Indochina, radio back if the invasion fleet stirred. They were the eyes of a nation on the brink. The crews aboard Lanikai and Isabel worked quickly. Tolley, given command of Lanikai, later described his orders with some unease. Sail close to Cam Ranh Bay, where the Japanese fleet lay anchored, and report if it began moving south. It was a monumental endeavor, one meant for an entire task force. As things were, it was one sailboat against the Empire's navy. By December 7th, the ships were nearly ready to depart. They were stripped of confidential material, issued false cover stories, and told to scuttle if necessary. Isabel's captain was told to broadcast a decoy message about searching for a downed patrol plane. Lanikai's guns, a single 3-pounder and a machine gun, were little more than decorations. What mattered was the flag, the presence, the possibility that one of these tiny vessels might be sunk. It did occur to some of the men that they were being used as bait, but they dismissed the idea. They chose to believe their country would never use them like that. Lanikai and Isabel waited in the harbor, positioned along Japan's expected invasion path. On the night of December 7th, 1941, Manila Bay was still. The Lanikai's crew prepared for departure. Engines warmed, charts were studied. Tolley stood on deck, unaware that a world-altering message was en route. In the early hours of December 8th, the news broke. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. 8 battleships were hit. Over 2,400 Americans were lost. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled. Roosevelt's carefully laid tripwire operation was no longer needed. The war had arrived, not with a sunken schooner, but with a sucker punch to the heart of the American Navy. Admiral Hart immediately cancelled the patrol mission. Lanikai never sailed for Cam Ranh Bay. Isabel never shadowed the Japanese fleet. Molly Moore was never even outfitted. In Washington, Roosevelt appeared shaken. Navy Secretary Frank Knox later recalled, "He expected to get hit, but not hurt." Historians would debate that quote for decades. Some conspiracy theorists argue that Roosevelt wanted war, especially with Germany, just as the McCollum Memo from 1940 had envisioned pressure Japan, provoke a strike, and enter the war through the back door. But Roosevelt miscalculated badly. In the years after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's motives became a battlefield. Critics pointed to his escalating pressure on Japan, the embargo, the relocation of the fleet to Hawaii, and the hardened diplomatic stance as steps meant to force a confrontation. Revisionists like John T. Flynn and later Robert Stinnett argued that Roosevelt had sought exactly this result. Stinnett's 1999 book, Day of Deceit, presented declassified documents, including the McCollum Memo, a detailed step-by-step guide on how to stay ahead of Japan as both sides escalated towards war. This proved that Roosevelt wanted Japan to fire the first shot. However, the official account doesn't even entertain the possibility. It is crystal clear. Roosevelt wanted to deter Japan, not invite disaster. He was preparing for war, not orchestrating it. Top military advisors like General Marshall and Admiral Stark had urged him, as late as November, to avoid conflict with Japan. US war plans called for Europe first. Germany, not Japan, was the true enemy, yet Roosevelt could not ignore Japan's moves either. Washington risked looking weak if Japan seized Southeast Asia's resources and bypassed US holdings. Worse, Japan's rise would jeopardize the Allied cause in the Pacific. Under this official view, the small vessels were likely a compromise, visible enough to detect Japanese aggression, but modest enough not to provoke it. Roosevelt's actions can be seen as those of a man boxed in by isolationist politics, aggressive Axis powers, timing, and geography. But there is still a possibility, backed by the strange December First Order, which suggests that if it wasn't for Pearl Harbor, FDR would have gone to extreme lengths, even sacrificing the lives of US servicemen to enter a war he knew the US was destined to put an end to.